Welcome back to Africa Science Focus, the science and development show from SciDevNet. I am Ogechi Kenyan. We're back for another episode, and this week we're looking at communicating indigenous science knowledge in Africa. Why is it so often neglected or even lost in comparison with Western science? And how can it be encouraged, communicated, and given the respect it deserves?
Indigenous knowledge and traditions hold a lot of significance today. These are systems that work. They are the ways that we should live our lives. And also these things, for me, they are connected to land. So they remain important even if many people do not take them serious in today's day and age.
Eurocentric influences that date back to the colonial era have really contributed to the relegation of traditional knowledge systems in Africa.
We are not doing research for farmers. We need to do research with farmers.
Our starting point is a report titled Past, Present and Future, Perspectives on the Development of an Indigenous Science Communication Agenda in Nigeria. It examines the impact of Western influences brought by the colonial era on traditional African knowledge systems. Our reporter, Michael Kaloki, speaks with Temilade Sheso, lead author of the study and social development researcher at the University of Ibadan in Nigeria.
That paper, the short title for it is Looking Back to Launch Forward, and those were carefully chosen terms. And what that paper does is it highlights the way that Eurocentric influences that date back to the colonial era have really contributed to the relegation of traditional knowledge systems in Africa. Maybe have even driven the relegation of those systems in Africa. And in that paper, 3 key ways forward that we recommend is, 1, African societies need to return to basic education systems. So we're talking of primary, secondary educational systems that are rooted in the realities of African societies. For example, teaching subjects like math in local languages so that children, especially in indigenous communities, can relate. And so by implication, this implies the valorization of native languages, like deliberately integrating those into the curriculum. And second way forward that we recommend is the need to build research agendas in higher education systems that are contextually relevant. And then thirdly is the research and the knowledge that is produced in these more contextually relevant systems needs to be disseminated via platforms that speak to the African people from the African people. So yes, old-fashioned academic journals, but also SciComm platforms like Africa Science Focus, where we're talking now. And so it's about moving African narratives and perspectives from the periphery to the center. This is a deliberate agenda of centering those narratives because they are valid.
We hear from Temilade, who unpacks the impact of Western scientific knowledge and methods on African cultures and societies.
The main damage that has been done here is a failure to recognize the plurality in the way that Western science has come to dominate global knowledge production. The truth is, all knowledge, even knowledge that has originated from the West, all knowledge is first of all local, and knowledge grounded in one locality is just as valid as that grounded in another locality. So, the Indian feminist Vandana Shiva speaks of epistemic violence, quote unquote. And the epistemic violence that has been wrought across Africa is the disruption or even discontinuation of the systems and institutions of knowledge production in many of our societies. There are many examples I could think of, including in critical areas such as health and education. But maybe the one I want to highlight here is how the Green Revolution of the 60s and 70s do some good in Asia, especially in India. Didn't take off quite as well in Africa. But in spite of that, it has had long-lasting impacts on food security, nutrition, dietary diversity in many African countries. So part of the intervention then was, to import wheat, basically to save lives. And the introduction of wheat into local diets then was seen as a life-saving move. However, today you have many African countries continue to depend on, with imports. Whereas the potential of local substitutes like cassava remains underdeveloped. And what's ironic is now some of the same groups that championed the cause of mass wheat imports decades ago are now campaigning for a return to quote unquote revolutionary native crops, like this cassava that I mentioned, and farming practices to say actually these are more sustainable locally than depending on wheat for imports. But now, because it's become a staple, wheat has become a staple now of many African diets, certainly in Nigeria, where I'm speaking from, that shift, that reversal is much harder to accomplish. So that's just an example of that kind of upheaval and disruption that has happened.
Ayodele Ibiyemi is co-author of a study that examines indigenous knowledge communication in Africa. He worries that Western science and colonial era mindsets have suppressed African traditional active thinking approaches.
It would be unfair for anyone to even think that there's no active thinking taking place on the African continent regarding indigenous knowledge and traditions. Everything that we do is moderated by a system that is exogenous to us. The way our countries are named, the clothes that we wear, the language that we speak, the language that I speak right now is the colonial language. Everything is moderated and operated through this external system. However, there is active thinking taking place regarding this. And there are people, policymakers, journalists, culture workers, writers, even politicians, surprisingly. So there are thousands of people doing this active thinking and who are trying to reconcile our place in this modern world, in this world of globalization, quote and unquote. But unfortunately, they've not found expression. Because when we talk about indigenous science, for example, it is just there. Nobody funds them. Some of it seem like they've been eroded. Some of them have been lost, regrettably. But still, there are people doing these things. There are people practicing these things. But it doesn't have to be either or. And when we look at indigenous thinking also, it is not a system that is fossilized. It is not this system that is fixed in the past. A constantly evolving system. And my favorite example of that indigenous tradition working with Western style science is a project that was initiated by the former governor of Ondo State in Nigeria. It was called the Abiye project. In the Yoruba language, Abiye means to give birth alive. So the project was designed to reduce maternal mortality, and it did reduce it by over 70%. Basically, there were indigenous local midwives who are called Iya Abiye. These people had their own method that Western science would consider as crude, that they delivered babies. So the government simply empowered them, trained them, and integrated them into the system. So a woman who had to deliver a baby did not necessarily have to go to the big hospital, did not necessarily have to wait for the doctors. These women were trained in a way that combined the knowledge of Western science with their own indigenous knowledge, and we saw that it worked. However, the problem we have in many African countries is the unsustainability of policies. When the government comes, they abandon a system, whether it works or not. They don't even do any review because we do not think in terms of systems, we think in terms of politics. It is this fleeting way of thinking that is making it seem, that even necessitates the idea of asking ourselves if there's any active thinking taking place. It is because we do not take it serious. So active thinking is taking place.
So basically, Ayodele, what you're saying is that the government has a crucial role to play in pushing forward the indigenous knowledge and tradition.
Absolutely. Government needs to fund science. That is how it is done anyway. Most of the African countries have to rely on foreign grants because they don't get supported enough by the ruling class, by the government. These are practices that have to be actively supported and encouraged by the government. It's one thing for people to have an idea. It's another thing for it to be able to find expression. Without government support, these ideas cannot find expression.
Now, Ayodele, you have also contributed to discussions in the media that have explored communication of indigenous scientific knowledge. From your perspective, is indigenous scientific knowledge being communicated at a level comparable with how Western-style science is being communicated on the African continent?
The answer to that question is no. Absolutely no. Indigenous scientific knowledge is not being communicated at the level comparable to Western science. The thing is that everybody wants to be this global citizen. And being global, unfortunately for the system, it's actually being Western. It is synonymous with westernization, which it should not be. So a lot of the communication of this Western science is done at the expense of indigenous knowledge. I'll share an experience which I like to share. When I was growing up in Nigeria, in primary school, we were punished for speaking our own indigenous language. That's the way languages are being killed. It's this idea of linguicide, where it's a linguistic equivalent of genocide. So the language itself is being eroded. People cannot even speak their language. So in terms of communication, no, indigenous scientific knowledge is not even being communicated at all. We have a dismissive attitude toward it because we don't think it is on the same level with Western style science.
Ayodele, just to say that I also experienced the same when I was in primary school. We were not allowed to speak our indigenous languages, and I think that applies for several parts of the African continent in their education systems. Now, if in our generation, I would say the Generation X, the millennials, these are people who cannot or do not speak their language, then what can be done, Ayodele, if language is such a strong determining factor?
In terms of what can be done, we have to do it on two levels. The first level is at the level of the individual parents, individual himself. People are adults. In my culture, we would say that when they give back to somebody, you have to rebirth yourself. So as an adult, how much of your language can you speak? How much of your own thinking? A lot of our thoughts as Africans are encoded in our language, in our sayings. When I interact with people from other African countries, they have a way of expressing themselves that carries their culture. Language bears our culture. That's the first level. Parents also have to operate in a way that they make sure that their children are able to speak their language. The second level is that the government and institutions have to be able to change things. People who cannot speak their language are lost people. How can you communicate your own science when you cannot speak your language? When you don't think that your language is worth anything? Our ancestors did not speak English. Nigeria, we speak, I think, close to 500 languages in Nigeria alone. There are multiple dialects and multiple languages in Nigeria. A lot of people want to aspire to English. English is like an aspirational language. So we do not promote our language. People do not even see the utility of learning this language. The teachers who punish people for speaking their own indigenous languages, the logic of it, which is illogical, but the logic of it is that you do not need this language in your future. Speak the English language which you need. So we frame English as this language of the future, our own languages as being languages of the past. And this is how we lose most of our identity. I always say that I'm not an Englishman, and I'm never going to be an Englishman. So why should I speak only the English language? That's the problem. So people have to make concerted efforts at the individual level and at the level of government also.
I think language is at the core of the problem of the relegation of indigenous knowledges in Africa. And it works both ways. So just the other day, I found myself here trying to translate new developments around livestock management policy in Nigeria to a non-English speaking person. And I got stuck on the word livestock. And this is an issue that, potentially impinges on the rights of many Nigerians to land and to food as well. So it's a problem if the core concept, this core concept, which is currently being hotly debated among the elites in the country. So yes, language is a big barrier. One other formidable barrier, I think, links to the issue of language, and that is the social and cultural distance between those of us Africans educated in the Eurocentric tradition and our fellow country people who have not been inside, quote unquote, the four walls of a school. But many of these people are indigenous knowledge holders, almost like guardians of that knowledge. So this artificial veneration of Western knowledge has created this hierarchy and a very real power dynamic in which, quote unquote, we are assumed to know more than, quote unquote, them. But this makes it difficult for people educated in this tradition to listen and learn from people who are non-English speaking people. But even when sometimes, there's attempts at translation or interpretation, or somehow both sides get to speak the same language, there is still this deep-seated hubris that really does need to be eradicated for us to start having mutually respectful communication both ways. And I think that word respect, that notion of respect, is really critical here.
Next, we travel to Western Kenya. As children walk to school along a nearby road, we look out over fields where reporter Michael Kaloki is meeting a biotechnologist who likes to be known as Dr. Fun. Dr. Fun is dedicated to making science fun and engaging. He explains why he's passionate about raising awareness of indigenous scientific knowledge and its value.
I'm standing here in a millet plantation, next to a major road, I should say, and this is in the town of Ukwala, about 425 kilometers northwest of the Kenyan capital, Nairobi. And standing next to me is someone who feels at home in a plantation such as this one. He's actually waving his arms saying, yes, yes, yes. And he's none other than Dr. Kenneth Monjero. He is a biotechnologist working with the Kenya Agricultural and Livestock Research Organization. He is also the founder of Fun and Education Global Network. Dr. Monjero, you plan to put in place an initiative to create awareness about indigenous scientific knowledge. Could you describe what you plan to do?
Thank you. I'm so happy, and you have found me in my right place in the plantation of sorghum here. I'm happy to...
Hang on, is this sorghum or millet?
Oh, millet, I mean.
Yes.
Yeah,
I'm correcting a biotechnologist. Isn't that a first?
Yes. So I'm really looking at indigenous knowledge as one of the areas that is being left behind, and we might not pick it up. Especially as we know, most people or those who have vast knowledge in indigenous knowledge are actually within our communities. And as their life goes on, and most of them are old people and all that, then we might lose and just will never know that this knowledge existed. So we really think about how can we revive and revamp even our younger generations to appreciate indigenous knowledge, because create awareness in young people, and this will also lead them to appreciating diverse knowledge. So my plan is to start with schools, and not just at higher level, but primary schools. How can we connect our primary schools, our teachers, with these indigenous people who have more information about indigenous knowledge?
Now, as I look to the distance there at the main road, I see some primary school students making their way to school. And Dr. Monjero, I should add that while you're here in the town of Ukwala, you're actually planning to take part in a science fair later on today. Tell me a little bit about this particular event.
My main mind is how can we reach out to every learner? We really need to expose this learner to all kinds of field, and that's why the field of indigenous knowledge is very, very vital, so that now as they grow up, they can actually select on various diverse areas. We're talking about even herbal medicine, that maybe even the industry might get that this product has what we need to cure HIV or any other illnesses. And then now that can lead to conservation of such kind of indigenous knowledge. In fact, most of these industries that are making medicines and all that will be coming now like to Ukwala to harvest what has been produced or to receive what has been produced in regards to indigenous plants. Right now we are talking about synthetic biology. We can actually develop our own from our local communities. So I'm actually engaging them to see that we also have indigenous medicines, indigenous plants, indigenous knowledge on how to use various kinds of knowledge from the region. So we are saying we need an inclusive approach. Girls, boys, marginalized areas, and Ministry of Education working in partnership with the industry, because they cannot achieve their vision of skill-based learning without bringing in professionals. And I want professors, doctors back to school, primary school, in such a way this child can really interact with and hear from the horse's mouth.
Now, where we are in Ukwala, this is the western part of Kenya. I should say that you also come from the western part of the country, and this area is known for indigenous plants. I actually saw some indigenous vegetables here, and these are vegetables that people are known to have eaten from way back then, probably centuries ago. What would you say is important about the indigenous tradition and culture here that people haven't left it that far behind compared to the rest of Kenya?
This might be because of the poverty of the area, so they are more inclined to their indigenous knowledge, like even the seed. They rarely buy the hybrids and all that. And also the other aspect is indigenous vegetables have thrived in the region. So they have been brought up with that and they still embrace it. So what I'm going to do, in fact, is to start like a cooking competition for indigenous vegetables, because most of them don't know how to prepare. So we want to start and establish connection between preparation and recipes. And young people can come up even with modern value addition in those indigenous vegetables, like making biscuits and adding in amaranth and all that. So those are things that we can actually do and make and engage young people here.
Now, you talked about young people there. Is there a gap in between the older generation and the younger generation in terms of indigenous knowledge? Perhaps younger people not being too keen on it?
Yeah, that's exactly the way you've said. Young people, there's a gap. And that's why young people grow up and then move off from their parents and all that. And they're not there to learn on what the old people are doing, because it was thought to be like a knowledge for illiterate people. But right now, we really need to bring it back to schools. And that's why we're saying digital technologies is good. All these modern technologies are good, but then we cannot fly on one wing. We need analog and digital altogether. We need to bring this indigenous knowledge in regards to making it and purposing to do so by bringing indigenous people even to schools, even storytelling. I've actually done one in a hotel in Nairobi, and I brought Maasai people with their medicine. I brought various people who talked about indigenous knowledge, and it was a wonderful round fire storytelling and how this indigenous knowledge is important and how it saved people in many ways.
Now, Dr. Monjero, you're passionate about indigenous scientific knowledge. What sparked this interest?
This is because I normally say, the technologies that were there in early ages, we are going back to that, especially even synthetic medicine. They are actually products that I've gotten from this herbal medicine. And I've seen it because I've been in India, because I've seen people literally using these plants. Aloe vera is here. Now we have a lot of products on market. So why go buy a product on market and yet you have aloe on your farm? So it is actually the same thing I'm talking about. What is sustainable way or model of using indigenous knowledge is actually to embed or bring indigenous people in school or within schools to engage these learners on how to use and the important significance of this indigenous knowledge.
Actually, when you mentioned aloe vera there, you reminded me of an instance where I was growing up and I'd never seen aloe vera before. I'd only seen it in commercials when they talk about these different beauty products using aloe vera. And then one day my mother showed me an aloe vera plant and I thought, but that's sisal. So, perhaps that's just an example of perhaps what some young people go through in terms of not understanding really all these local plants that, perhaps could be used for medicinal purposes. Anyway, that's just one example I'm giving, and that's, of course, using myself. Now, as a science communicator, Dr. Monjero, you have undertaken strategies of how to make science fun. In fact, you prefer to be called Dr. Fun. Now,
yes, right.
Tell me a little bit about that.
I realized that education is done because of exams. This sparked my interest because you see learners go to a lab or meet a scientist and actually they are lost completely because the way a scientist communicates is like he's communicating to learned fellows. So science communication is how can we simplify that knowledge that we have and be able to deliver it effectively to non-scientific audience. And number two is how can we develop interactives that attract engage and empower our learners. Like I do make clouds in the classroom. And whenever everyone hears, I'm making clouds in the classroom, how? Have you ever touched clouds? Why are we talking about clouds? They are far in the skies and all that. Then I do an experiment in the classroom, and they're able to actually engage more into discussion about how rain forms and what is climate change and what are our mitigations and all that. So how can we make it fun? We know puppetry, we know music, poetry. How can we communicate indigenous knowledge using these tools? Make songs, make storytelling, make it so attractive. And of course, learners would love to engage into a competitive kind of approach. So bring schools together, let them compose all those approaches to indigenous knowledge and come and share in a festival. So Indigenous Knowledge Festival, both in local schools and all that.
So what can we learn about communicating indigenous science knowledge and integrating Western knowledge? Temilade Sheson uses a YouTube video about the rainmakers of Ngaye to explain her ideas.
What it highlights is how this group of scientists from urban centers, from universities in Kenya, actually went into the forests of Ngaye in western Kenya to listen and learn from so-called rainmakers. For the scientists, the idea of rainmaking, it seemed mythical, it seemed non-rational. But somehow they got to the point where they said, we want to see what's in here, right? So they actually went into the forest and, spoke with the, as they call them in the video, old men. And they got to understand that actually, at the very least, what they did was forecast rain using natural science and extremely keen observational skills that had been honed across generations. One of the things that was interesting to me in that video was, scientists said those sequences in nature that the rainmakers were used to observing were actually more accurate at predicting rain than the scientific instruments that the scientists brought from their labs. And so that process sort of validated the indigenous knowledge that had been built over time in that community. And so there are several lessons to draw from this, but I'll close with 3 lessons from this and just more broadly. I would say, first and foremost, scientists and researchers like me need to be open to alternative sciences, alternative ways of knowing and being in the world. Second thing is, we need to, as scientists, engage in indigenous communities in transdisciplinary ways of working. So what transdisciplinarity does is it takes scientists out of the lab and into the real world, but not in a way to impose solutions, but in a way to co-create, co-produce, sometimes co-disseminate knowledge so that it gains more legitimacy and in a mutually respectful manner. And the third and final point here for me is, as scientists, we need to remember that our work is relevant only to the extent that it connects with society. The ultimate purpose is for science to benefit society. And it can only benefit society if we are connected in ways that promote mutual respect, engagement, communication, two-way communication. So we learn from indigenous communities. Indigenous communities also become more open, breaking down barriers, which actually are contrived barriers, I would say. But, breaking down those barriers and working in harmony and understanding that both sides do have something to offer to each other.
We've come to the end of Africa Science Focus for today. If you want to find out more, head to the SciDevNet website, and that's www.scidev.net. Today's show was produced by Martin Redfern, with editing by Titilope Fadere and Ogechi Kenyan. Today's reporter was Michael Kaloki. Until next time, goodbye. Africa Science Focus is produced by SciDevNet and distributed in association with your local radio station. This podcast was supported by the Science Granting Council's initiative which aims to strengthen the institutional capacities of 18 public science funding agencies in sub-Saharan Africa.